Hello and welcome to a lecture on the English colonies and slaves, and we're looking at key concept 2.2.1a, and you can have a read over that. I'm going to move on. So we're looking at slavery in this area here, what will become the United States. Now, the majority of slaves go, of course, to the West Indies and to South America. We're going to be focusing on this sort of minority, smaller group there, and we'll look at how it developed and how the labor system moved away from indentured servants and into slavery and what that meant and how that was done. So we've got to consider the two important factors of production are always land and labor. And in England, land is not really available and the population is high. So land was quite valuable, but labor was cheap. And there's too much labor. So there was encouraged people to migrate to the Americas to look for work there, or to be sort of pushed off the land. In America, it's sort of the opposite situation. There's lots of land, but not enough workers. Labor is expensive, and obtaining a supply of labor, if you need labor, was a challenge. And where labor was needed the most were on the plantations. This is a tobacco plantation, probably in the Chesapeake area, or in the sugar plantations, or later the rice plantations. So English and the plantations, they're really copying an economic model that was made successful by the Spanish and the Portuguese. So the English are not reinventing anything here. They're sort of copying what others have done. And they've got the same problem that the Spanish and the Portuguese get. How do you coerce, make people produce for you and to get a profit? And for the English, they'd gone sort of this route. Enslaved natives, and it's got problems. They can escape easily. They're dying off from disease, and you cannot coerce them into it, or there's just not enough of them, so that sort of dies off. They turn to indentured servitude, and the servants often would not survive their years of servitude, especially early on in places like Chesapeake. And as time progressed, less are willing to come. There's more opportunities in England. You hear the horror stories of the Americas that it's just not worth it, and so there's less willing to come over. And then especially after Bacon's Rebellion, there's concerns from the elites in society of a growing population of landless white poor. And so they turn to African slavery, and slave for life. Children are slaves, not susceptible to disease, especially like the tropical diseases, and it's more difficult for them to escape. So development, evolution, we'll just sort of look at it. The first Africans to come to what will be the United States come to Jamestown in 1619, but they're not defined as slaves or categorized. They're servants. They're equal to, say, a white English or Irish indentured servant. They're seen as the same. And early in Jamestown, Africans could become their own free people. They could own land, own slaves themselves. And there were instances of Africans who'd been brought over as servants, earned their freedom, and then succeeded in life and had slaves of their own. 1626, the first to New Amsterdam. 1640, the first documented slave for life, and it was done as a punishment here, the first one. And 1641, Massachusetts, ironically, will be the first colony to actually legalize slavery and say it is okay. Massachusetts later in the Civil War era will be the leaders in fighting against slavery. So there's the irony. And 1662, it's Virginia enacts a law that the child of a slave is also a slave, and the father is white and the mother African. The child is considered African. And so we can see it's really much later that we get this codified ruling coming in. By 1660s, most colonies have legalized and making them slaves for life. So it's around here that you get the switch from them being treated as servants to being treated as a slave. And then shortly afterwards, you get Bacon's Rebellion, which was a key turning point in discouraging indentured servants and moving more towards African slaves. So we can see sort of the turning point. The early time period, the high mortality, the white indentured servants tend to die off, and so you don't have a growing population of landless whites. Those that survive would get their land. But in the shift time period, they're surviving their terms of service, 5 to 7 years as a servant, and then they're looking to get land of their own, and the best land is starting to get eaten up, and so we get more white servants surviving and then not really having any land or opportunities, and they're restless, shiftless, a little maybe angry, and there's the rebellion in 1676, which was free whites and many free blacks as well participated in it. And we get the shift sort of in the 1700s to racial slavery to solve that problem of how do you get labor. This is showing the population of blacks in Virginia, Chesapeake, and where Bacon's Rebellion was. So we can see it really starts to take off around 1700. So 1680s onward, with the better British economy, less indentured servants willing to come over, plus Bacon's Rebellion, this is what shifts the elites and the landowners to turn to African slavery as your system, and it becomes codified, meaning there's rules, and it's racial. It's you're defined by slave by your skin color. And so the codes that are coming in, the rules, and it varied from place to place, but these are the general ones. A slave is a property, much like a horse. Children of slaves are slaves, and your property. Curfews, no assembling, no freedom of movement is taken away, sort of ways to prevent organization and sort of freedom of your slaves. They had no voice. They weren't citizens, so they cannot go before the law and accuse somebody of stealing or anything like that. They were often discouraged to read and write, because if they can read and write, they maybe can communicate over long distances and organize. And permissible to beat, killing a slave will not be punished. Here's one here. You may wish to pause and read over this slave code. And so we get in the southern United States especially, and in the West Indies, a society that looks like this, with the landowning white elite at the top. And then in the middle class are sort of like the landless white population. And there was punishments, these ones in the middle, they could bully the blacks at the bottom and not really face any kind of punishment. And there's no marriage between the two. Poor white, poor black are not allowed to get married. And so a culture develops in which the worst white is better than the best black. And this, this deep culture perpetuates itself through time and becomes like a rock solid thinking amongst all white people, and it's why racism develops very deeply within the fabric of American society and culture. And so you could be, as I said, like the poorest white, but you would still say, well, I'm better than that black man, and will continue for a long time. So plantations and demand for slaves, the demand for slaves increases, and if you get more slaves, then you can get better production, so you can get more wealth, and then you want to get more land, and then you need more slaves, and the system perpetuates itself. And we can see here the population of Virginia, as this is the African population. It starts to go up exponentially. And by the 1730s, they'd started to the slave population had started to perpetuate itself and reproduce itself, so that the importation and purchasing of new slaves from Africa, which is very expensive, that goes down a little bit. The most in-demand slaves are young men and young women, and women in particular, if they were good at reproducing, they're often given rewards of, if you can reproduce 10 children, I will give you your freedom. So there was incentive to have children. And then, of course, the children are valuable slaves that will grow up as well. And by 1730 in Chesapeake, the migration is over. In the Carolinas, it will continue. And Carolinas becomes more of an immigrant community, where the slaves are not reproducing at quite the same levels. And for them, it's more difficult to form sort of roots and families, which was easier in Chesapeake. So if we look, Chesapeake is here, and that's where the majority is, and that's tobacco. But later in the 1700s, the rice colonies of the Carolinas increases, and it causes a problem and leads to our final colony of Georgia in 1730s. It's a proprietary colony given to James Oglethorpe, and he sort of saw it as a haven for poor Englishmen to come over, and he didn't really want to have slavery. Later, slavery would develop there. And the Crown, the English government, was hoping that Georgia would develop into like a white man's buffer, shield for slaves trying to run away from the Carolinas into Florida. So here's the Carolinas, and Florida's just to the south, and this was Georgia here. And Spain controlled Florida, and they encouraged English African slaves to run away and escape to Florida. So Georgia's sort of being created as a buffer, as a shield to prevent that. And was largely successful in that regard. So advantages of using slavery: if you are the slave owner, they're your slave for life. It's self-perpetuating, naturally reproducing, and slaves are outsiders with no rights, no protection from the law. It's very difficult for them to escape. They'll be seen. And the limitations, well, always that fear, that paranoia that they're going to rise up and revolt. And they're expensive, and it locks up your capital within your labor. And if your worker, your slave dies, you've lost some capital for that. Slaves lack incentive to work, of course, so you have to motivate them to do their job through fear and violence. And it becomes quite inhumane. And to justify it in a Christian world, well, they come up with really stretching things and come up with stereotypes of why this is okay. And we'll look at some of these more when we get into the 19th century, the justification of using slaves. And the ideology of racism really takes root in the United States. So resistance, okay, now active resistance, an uprising, a violent, revolution is quite dangerous and is quite difficult to organize. And so resistance takes more passive forms. You slow the pace. You try not to work very hard. You pretend to be sick. You sabotage, break machines, and you steal or try to run away. And this led to some of the stereotypes that the Africans are lazy because, they're not willing to work. And there are a couple of slave uprisings. And one in New York, which is under the Dutch at this time, it's under the English, but under the Dutch rule, slaves had more freedoms. When the English came in, they sort of took that away from them, and there was a lot of resentment amongst the population. 20% in New York City were slaves in a port city. That was quite common. And in an urban setting, it's much easier to organize and plan ahead. And it's put down, and in the aftermath, many executed and stronger punishments coming into place. Stono River is in the Carolinas and the rice fields, and so it's a much more rural setting. Sunday morning when the white population is at church, there's a violent attack on white plantation families. They'd hoped to get to Florida, but were caught and executed. And we see a common theme to any slave uprising. The only one that succeeded was in Haiti. And all of them invited sort of countermeasures. And a common effect would be stricter laws, painful executions like burning alive or being pulled apart that are meant to deter, and collective punishment. You punish everybody in some form. And white Southerners really, as I mentioned before, have a lot of paranoia of the slave uprising. And finally, African culture. In time, it would blend African and American and English sort of cultures and become a new culture, like an African-American culture. They retained much of their African culture or adapted it. There's a mix of languages, so Africans are coming from places of different languages. So, sort of new language sort of develops amongst them that also mixes in English. Music and dance was very important to them. When they're in the fields, they're singing. And African Christianity develops, especially the story of Moses and Exodus, which is Moses leading the slaves out of Egypt and across the Red Sea. That story gave African slaves a lot of hope. Keeping marriages and families going. Now, marriage, it was illegal for slaves, but of course they're sort of doing it on their own. And family often was by the community, because many families are being broken up, and so they sort of saw themselves as a collective family, and they very much want to keep their African identity. And finally, this picture here is showing the mix of it, what they very much love to do, sing and dance. And the instruments that they are playing are European instruments like the violin or the fiddle, and African instruments like the banjo, this one here. So sort of showing that mix. Okay, that's where we're going to end. Thank you very much for listening.